Today we're going to talk about quotation marks, italics, and capitalization. So let's start with quotation marks, and we use quotation marks around the titles of short published works to set off words, to indicate direct quotations, and to quote within a quote. So for example, when we're quoting the titles of short works, we put a quotation mark at the beginning and the end of the exact title of that work. And short works include newspaper articles, magazine articles, journal articles, a chapter of a book, a poem, an essay, an episode of a TV show, an episode of a radio program, etc. Basically, if it's a piece of something bigger, you would put it in quotation marks. We also use quotation marks to set off words within a sentence. So for example, if you are talking about words within the sentence and the words are not part of the grammatical structure, you put quotation marks around them. So for example, if we say the difference between these two words is more than just an apostrophe, there would be no quotation marks in that sentence. But if you indicate what the actual words are, can't and can't, pronounced the same, spelled one with an apostrophe, one without, meaning two different things, to indicate that can't and can't are not part of the grammatical structure of the sentence, but the two words that you're referring to, you would put them in quotation marks. And you can also use italics instead of quotation marks for this reason. And probably what most people are familiar with, using direct quotes, quotation marks around direct quotes, so that you're indicating this is exactly the wording as the original source. So here I have a screenshot of a CDC article, and I've picked one sentence that I want to quote, and I've put it in box brackets here. So here it is, without the quotes, and to indicate this is not my sentence, because right now without anything around it, this tells readers that I wrote this, which is definitely not true, which is a form of plagiarism. So I have to put quotation marks around the exact wording, and everything that is between the beginning or opening quotation mark and the closing quotation mark has to be word for word exactly the same as the original. And the exception would be if you take words out, you can use the ellipses, the dot, 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 to indicate where you've removed words. Here's an example where the same sentence has been worked into my own sentence. So I am introducing the quote by working it into my sentence, and then I actually start the quote 3 words in rather than using the full quote. So the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, this is APA citation 2016, believe the U.S. Zika Pregnancy Registry and the Puerto Rico Zika Active Pregnancy Surveillance System, quote, will help healthcare providers as they counsel pregnant women affected by Zika, etc., etc. Closing quotation mark, and then because it's APA, we need to indicate what paragraph it came from, since it was an online article without page numbers. So from these quotation marks, the reader can tell that everything in green would be me, my writing. Everything that's in white would be word for word exactly the same as the original source. This happens sometimes where you're quoting a source that is already using a quote, so you would need to indicate a quote within a quote. So I have an example here that we're going to be pulling this first sentence of this paragraph that we're going to be quoting, and note that the author wrote some wording and then quoted Dr. Pritish. And so you can see here, what we do is we take the quoted material that was already quoted in the chunk we're going to quote, and we put single quotation marks around it. So single quotation mark here, single quotation mark here. And then we put the double or regular quotation marks around those at the beginning and the end. And then because it is a APA example here, we have the author, year, and paragraph number, and an in-text citation at the end of the sentence. So this tells the reader, I am quoting a source, who then starts quoting somebody, and that quote continues until the end of the sentence, and also concludes my quote of the source. This example, which you may actually see if you're using sources from journals and magazines from other countries, for example, which is the reverse, is considered incorrect for standard edited American English, but considered correct for other countries. So for example, British English does this. What probably makes more sense, they start with a single quotation mark to indicate that they are quoting, and then if their source starts quoting, they use the double quotation mark. So it's actually the reverse. But in the US, you would not do this. The instructor could mark it as incorrect because it's not the correct American convention or rule that we adhere to. And there are some times when you definitely should not be using quotation marks. So for example, when you are summarizing, you're not using the source's exact language, so do not quote. When you're paraphrasing, also sometimes called an indirect quotation, you are not actually quoting, not using the same wording, so do not use quotation marks. And an interesting one I'll give you an example of is that in MLA and APA, if you use a very long quote, called a long quote or a block quote, you do not actually use quotation marks. You instead indent the quote and set it up a little bit differently. And for APA style, that's over 40 words is the cutoff, at which point you would switch it from a regular quote setup to a long quote or block quote. Also, don't use quotation marks when you're trying to be humorous or sarcastic, and don't use quotation marks when you're indicating a metaphor or slang term. So here's an example of a long quote or a block quote, and this is in APA style. So everything that is white, this humongous chunk here, which is big even for a long quote, is all word for word exactly the same from the source. And then at the beginning, we have a quote introduction that says, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, 2016, are still in the early stages of tracking and understanding Zika. And then you have the whole quote that's talking about that. And then the other half of the in-text citation showing what paragraph it came from. So the issue with this is that it should not be used very commonly for undergraduate level writing. It's more common that you would use this setup if you are doing your own interviews. So you're going out and you're interviewing people to gather information. It's more likely that you would use this, that you would need more than 40 words at a time to be used for a quote. What ends up happening is that people use these long quotes or block quotes because it's easy to get a lot of words really quickly to take up space in their essay. And then also they think that they don't have to either introduce them or to follow up and explain what they're showing and why after they've used the quote. And that's not true. You need to introduce it, and you need to then follow up and explain what this is showing, what this is demonstrating, analyze it, evaluate it, whatever you need to do. So you need to make sure that you use block quotes correctly and that you set them up correctly, which most often they have a colon, sometimes they have a comma preceding the quote itself. The quote is then indented with a tab, so all of the quote is flush indented. And then this is an example where the period comes before the end of the in-text citation for APA, and that is one of the rare examples where it comes before instead of coming after. All right, so where do you put the quotation mark in the sentence? So most often you're going to have the quotation mark, the punctuation mark that you need to use with the quotation mark, have that come inside or before the quotation mark. So for example, if you have a period, then you'd have the quotation mark, comma, then the quotation mark, question mark, then the quotation mark. And there are a couple that show up both places. For example, dashes. You would have this come before the quotation mark if you're interrupting a quote. Usually this is used more for literary works or works where you're having dialogue between two characters and you're interrupting a character speaking. For essays that are written for academic purposes, you can start and stop a quote wherever you want, so you don't have to indicate that you're cutting it off, at least with APA style, cutting the quote off early. And then parentheses, if they are part of the quote, would be inside the quotation mark. You have two that are always on the outside, so that the quotation mark would come first, and then a colon, quotation mark first, and then a semicolon. And the first column here with the period, comma, question mark, and exclamation mark, that is most often the case, like 99% of the time that is the case. However, you can have those punctuation marks be outside of the quotation mark if you're using just a word or a phrase, instead of using like quoting a whole sentence or quoting a majority of a sentence. So I'll give you some examples here. Punctuation inside of the quotation marks. You've got your quotation marks around the sentence. The period comes on the inside to indicate this is the end of the sentence, the end of the quote, end quotation mark. However, I want to note that if you're using APA style, APA citation style, you would actually have the quote be around the sentence without any ending punctuation mark, and then the ending closing quotation or closing punctuation mark to end the sentence would be at the end after the in-text citation. So notice you have nothing here. You have no period, no comma, no semicolon, nothing. And then the period actually comes after the in-text citation with the author, the date of publication, and the location of the quote. Here's an example of punctuation outside of the quotation mark. So for example, if you're using just a word or a phrase that needs to be in quotation marks, you would have that quotation mark end the phrase and then have a period to end the whole sentence. And here's another example where you have the quotation marks, and then you would have a semicolon indicating that this is the end of one complete sentence connected to the next complete sentence with a semicolon, so they're on the same point or detail. And again, I do want to point out this is how it's used in standard edited American English. It is different in other countries depending on, interestingly enough, depending on what type of printing press they used in the 1800s and how well punctuation marks would appear at the end of a line on the edge of a page. So again, this is just standard edited American English version, what you're expected to do. All right, so let's talk about italics briefly here. So when using italics, these are the tilted letters, tilted words that in some fonts are very easy to see, other fonts are more difficult to see. Generally speaking, italics have replaced underlining. Underlining was the way that we would indicate these things in writing when we use typewriters and other kinds of programs that weren't smart enough to use italics. And so now we obviously don't use typewriters anymore, and almost every program that we use is smart enough to be able to have italics. So it's pretty much a non-concern at this point, and you should just always use italics instead of underlining. And you use italics for the titles of long published works, so the opposite of the short published works that need quotation marks. You use italics for ships, aircraft, and spacecraft, which is something that nobody remembers. So that's one that you wouldn't pick up very easily from seeing examples of writing, because people forget to do that all the time. Sometimes you're encouraged to put foreign words that are not yet part of the English language in any standardized capacity in italics, although I would argue that it's not necessary anymore. And then lastly, to indicate emphasis, it is a way to emphasize certain words, but again, there's other ways that you can make sure your sentences are clear without using italics. So the titles of long works in the book, Zika, the Emerging Epidemic, Donald McNeil discusses new evidence that Zika in pregnant women can cause abnormal brain development in fetuses through mother-to-child transmission. The title is in italics here, even if it's hard to tell. Again, that's because sometimes italics isn't very clear depending on what font style you're using. And for those of you who are wondering, there are commas around the title, not because it is a title, but because of the sentence. So in this example, in the book, Donald McNeil discusses blah, blah, blah. That is the actual sentence, and giving the title of the book is a non-essential phrase or a non-essential piece of information that we're sneaking in to the sentence, so you would put a comma around the title. Since it's not essential, we're sneaking it in. So we need to interrupt the sentence with commas. And another example, so this is how it works when you have a article title that needs to be in quotation marks, and if you also want to indicate the publication title where it was published, you can do that, although it's not typically necessary unless there's some important reason for including the publication title. So in the article, Zika virus and its associated diseases, published in the New England Journal of Medicine, Musso Coimbaud identify congenital defects associated with Zika, including microcephaly. So in this example here, you have the title of the article, Zika virus and its associated diseases. This is the name of the 20-page article that was published within the publication, the journal, the New England Journal of Medicine. So the New England Journal of Medicine is usually like several hundred pages long. This was one article that was published within it. So again, smaller piece, bigger piece. And if you wanted to, you would not have to mention the publication unless you think it's important people know that it's in the New England Journal of Medicine, which is one of the top tier medical publications. But you could also choose not to include the title of the article either, and you could just delete these first two lines and just say Musso Coimbaud identify congenital defects associated with Zika, including microcephaly. And then because you have an in-text citation in the reference page, the reader would be able to look up what article and publication it was in. So you do have choices as writers. All right, so what are considered long works? So the names of newspapers, names of magazines, like the New York Times, names of journals, like the Annals of Medicine, books, whether those are nonfiction, fiction, whatever, all book titles are long works and italicized. And that includes shorter books like novellas, still italicized. And you have movies, TV, the whole TV series, video game titles, another one people tend to forget, needs to be italicized. Works of visual art, another one people forget, and radio programs as opposed to an episode of a program. and musical compositions, etc. Note, do not italicize the title of religious works, even if they are books like the Bible or the Mahabharata. Do not italicize those according to standard edited American English. And do not italicize the name of legal documents, even if they are books. Again, those are just quirks that somewhere along the line we came up with and people agree to follow. Here's one that people forget all the time, which is to italicize the names of ships, aircraft, and spacecraft. So to give an example, New Horizons, which is the spacecraft that just recently flew past Pluto and gave us really good photos of Pluto and its moons. That needs to be italicized. New Horizons is the name of the spacecraft. So New Horizons launched January 19, 2006, and conducted a 6-month reconnaissance flyby of Pluto and its moons. Another example, the USNS Comfort is a Mercy-class hospital ship docked in Manhattan, but this is not the first time that Navy hospital ships have come to New York in response to a pandemic. So the name of the actual ship is Comfort, and the formal full name is USNS, which I'm not up to date on my Navy abbreviations, but I believe it's something like United States Navy Ship Comfort. That needs to be italicized. And right now, this is up a little bit for debate, whether or not to italicize foreign words. And what we mean by foreign words are words in any other language that have not been standardized as part of the English language. And the easiest way to check if they've been standardized is to see if they're in the dictionary. So the dictionary has over 500,000 words that says, you know, these are words that we use in the English language. They have definitions. Sometimes they give the etymology, etc. Sometimes it's just, you know, like a pronunciation guide, etc. But they appear according to the authority of certain dictionaries, and all dictionaries don't necessarily agree with each other, but it's being recognized. But this is tricky because a lot of words, actually most of the words in the English language, are made up of other languages, words in other languages, and were considered foreign at one time. So we're still doing this. English is an ever-changing language. So in the past, we took words from other languages and sometimes kept the meaning, sometimes changed the meaning, sometimes kept the spelling, sometimes changed the spelling, and said these are our words now. And we still do this to this day. We're still adding words from other languages to English, which is part of the reason why it's hard to have any rules for spelling, because we're taking words from all different kinds of languages that have all different kinds of spelling conventions. And also why you're never going to know every single word in the English language, and that's okay, right? You always have access to a dictionary now because you always have access to a cell phone, right? Or something where you can look up the definitions of words. So for those of you who are curious, 29% of the English language comes from French words. Some examples are veal, pork, prince, sympathetic, allure, rendezvous, allowance, apostrophe, even describing the English language writing conventions, debris, and risque. And these words you may not think of as French because they are very clearly English words. We use them. They have very common understanding from people. If you use the word prince, everybody should know what you're talking about. But you can see an example of we're using other spelling conventions. So you can see in the word debris, you have that silent S, which is common in French words. Risque has an accent letter, which we do not recognize with the American alphabet. So you can see that these have come from other words, or other languages, even though these words are mainstays, very common in the English language. Latin, we have about 29% of our words from the Latin language, like carpe diem, per diem, vice versa, pro bono, cystoscopy, craniotomy, dermatitis, and basically most medical terms and phrases are coming from Latin. And we started out that way because the people who held that knowledge were speaking Latin, but also now it's in deference to um, recognizing the history of medicine and going way back, that far back, that we continue to use Latin naming systems to give new discoveries, new illnesses, etc. Latin names. And the Germanic languages are responsible for about 26% of the English language, including Proto-German, Old English, Middle English, German, etc. And these are words like angst, wonderkind, kindergarten, prattle, bagel, hamster, cow, also, make. And these are words that we took, and again, very common words like bagel, right? And the other biggest category would be Greek, which makes up 6% and is responsible for a lot of our science words like physics, alchemy, taxonomy, economics, any of the ologies, zoology, biology, photography, bacterium, utopia, etc. And so you can see that we've got all these words from other languages. Almost 90% of our words are from all these other languages, and then the rest are from other languages as well. So would you italicize all of them? Then almost every sentence, because it has a word that was foreign in origin, every sentence would have almost every word italicized. So it's like, where do you draw the line, and what's the purpose of drawing the line, right? So APA citation, if you're following that style, does not directly recommend italicizing uncommon or unrecognized foreign words. So you can choose not to. And another argument for italicizing foreign words is that it can be viewed as a type of gatekeeping, where you're saying certain words from certain languages are acceptable to be English and be recognized as such, and other words and other languages are not. So it's kind of a inequities related issue. But just to give you an example of what it could look like, I'm going to use a Danish word here. The sense of hygge, I'm totally mispronouncing that, I'm sure, was strong as the close friends gathered around the bonfire. So this is a Danish word meaning roughly coziness, if we were translating it in English. And we would, if you're following the rule, you would italicize that because most people in the US have not heard of this word. And so you would be calling out that it's not in our dictionary and it's not well known. An example where we're using a less common French phrase that would not be italicized because it is in our dictionary is pièce de résistance, which you can pronounce with a French accent or not. To say the cake was the pièce de résistance of the meal, meaning it was the most important or remarkable feature of the meal. We use that so often, and so many people know what it means or roughly know what it means, that you would not italicize it, even if you did decide to italicize foreign words. All right, and then lastly, italicizing for emphasis or clarity. Generally, you're encouraged not to do that, particularly if you're doing any kind of technical writing or writing for the workplace. Instead, the better tactic is to put important words or phrases at the beginning, or if needed at the end of a sentence, and or to break long sentences into shorter sentences so it's clear what you mean without emphasizing or drawing attention to certain words. So to give you an example, when completing the multi-step process, do a safety check before starting any steps involving power tools. Okay, so here they're saying it's very important, right, to do this before any steps with power tools. But rather than having it hidden in the middle of the sentence and then having to italicize it to make sure it gets the attention it needs, instead, you could have it at the beginning of the sentence and have a shorter sentence altogether. Before starting any steps involving power tools, do a safety check. And that is just considered clear to the reader, and the emphasis is at the beginning, so it's easier for the reader to pick up. Shorter sentence, easier to understand and not get lost, etc. All right, and lastly, when to capitalize words. And the one you're probably most familiar with is that proper nouns need to get capitalized, titles need to get capitalized, first words of a sentence need to get capitalized, and then some less common ones. If you're quoting a sentence, the first word needs to be capitalized, and acronyms. So for proper nouns, those are official recognized names of a person, place, or thing that we need to capitalize. And by comparison, we do not capitalize common nouns, which are not a specific name, but either a descriptor or just not a proper noun that we would not capitalize it. So to give some examples, a proper noun, you have Lake Superior, which is a specific lake in the middle of the Midwest here. And then you have the lake, which could technically be any lake. We're not sure what lake you're talking about. Hopefully the context of the sentence would provide more information. But because you're not naming it, you would lowercase lake. All right, grandfather, if you're directly addressing your grandfather and saying, grandfather, welcome, let's have dinner, whatever. It's capitalized because it's a direct address title. But if you're saying my grandpa or the grandfather or whatever, it needs to be lowercase because you're identifying your relationship to them, but you're not indicating that that is their proper noun for capitalization. For classes and for programs and degrees, areas of study, you would lowercase geography. I'm getting a geography degree. If you're saying I'm taking a geography class, you lowercase it. If you are giving the exact name of a class, though, you would capitalize it. So Geography 101, Human Geography, is the exact name of the class, the one class that has its official recognized name of that, right? So you would capitalize it. The exception to that would be languages, so English, French, Latin, etc. If you have an English class, English is always capitalized because it is the name of a language, and that's somewhere along the line how we decided it was going to be. So the English class is always capitalized, English degree is capitalized, etc. An example of something weird that's going on now is that people, in a bid to be unique or get more attention, are creating businesses and products where they're either not capitalizing or they're flipping capitalization rules. So for example, you have the iPhone where the I is lowercase and you have the P of the phone capitalized, and yes, you leave it like that always, every time. That is the proper noun, the way that it's capitalized. So that is what you have to do. However, if you're talking about a cell phone, a smartphone, a phone, period, you would lowercase it. And a tricky one for people who have to work in the field of medicine is whether or not the name of an illness is capitalized. And so you should assume the illness would actually be lowercase unless it is named after a person, place, or thing that is capitalized. So for example, the common cold, rhinovirus, is lowercase. But if you have the Zika virus, that is named after a place. It's a Ugandan forest. since it's named after a place with a proper noun, Zika, the illness, retains its proper noun status. So Zika, Munchausen syndrome, Ebola, those are all capitalized because they're named after people and places. However, if you're talking about the mosquito-borne illness, or the blood illness, or the blood disease, or whatever, it's lowercase. And the names of places and buildings, capitalized. If you're just referring to the technical college, though, you would lowercase it. The same with titles. If you're giving the title with the person's name, capitalize it. If you are just giving the title to refer to the person, it is lowercase. When we're working with titles, you need to capitalize some of the words, but not all of them. So to give you an example here, infectious disease from A to Z, Zika case is lower, but virus remains a risk. The I is capitalized, D is capitalized. A through Z letters that appear on their own are capitalized. Zika is a proper noun. It's also the first word of the subtitle, so it's capitalized, etc. So here are the rules. Capitalize the first word of the title and the subtitle. So capitalized infectious here because it's the first word. Capitalized Zika here because it's the first word of the subtitle. So even if this were the word the, you would still capitalize it because it's the first word. You need to capitalize major words, and that includes nouns, pronouns, verbs, adjectives, and adverbs. And I know some people get the, if it's 4 letters or longer, capitalize it. And technically that is not correct. It's like a good rule of thumb to get people started. But in reality, these are the things you need to capitalize. And it doesn't matter if they're 3 letters long, 4 letters long, they need to be capitalized. And the following that do not need to be capitalized, it doesn't matter how long those words are, they should not be capitalized. So articles like a, an, and the should be lowercase, like a risk. Again, remember the exception is if it's the first word of the title or the subtitle. Do not capitalize prepositions, so the words that are showing relationship or direction with other words. So from, some other prepositions, with, around, under, through, toward, between, etc. And notice how some of these words are quite long. So that's another reason why the 4-letter rule doesn't work, because you would capitalize this word incorrectly because it's over, 3 letters in length. And we lowercase the coordinating conjunctions, which, remember the acronym fanboys, for, and, nor, but, or, yet, so. And we always lowercase those. And I have an example right here with the word but. And of course, the exception is if they're the first word of the title or subtitle. Otherwise, they are lowercase. And I do want to point out that this is the way it is for use in a document, in an essay, in a report, etc. But if you're using APA style, that the reference page has other rules just to mess with you, I think. Just joking. They came up with their own set of rules, and so it's inconsistent with this. So when you're creating your APA reference page, always check to see if something needs to be capitalized or not. And this one most people are familiar with. Capitalize the first word of a sentence, obviously, right? But there are some rare exceptions. So remember that tricky iPhone. So if you're using the word iPhone and it's at the beginning of a sentence, you would in fact leave it the I lowercase and the P capitalized. And unfortunately, this is becoming more and more common, so it's going to be more and more visible in writing as people continue to try to stand out with their products and their businesses. Another example is some people have enough reputation and fame to have their name lowercase. So they're choosing to lowercase their name for a certain reason. And if they're well enough known, like E.E. Cummings or Bell Hooks, you would know that or be able to see that in other people's writing, that it's lowercase, and you would honor that even if it's the first word of the sentence. So Bell Hooks is a well-known American author, professor, and social activist. The unconventional lowercasing of her name signifies that what is most important to her is her works, the substance of books, not who I am. So going against the conventional capitalization rules. And to see an example of capitalizing in a quote, if you have a whole sentence that you're quoting, capitalize the first word. So you might have a signal phrase like according to the CDC, comma, quote this information, etc., etc. An example of a blended quotation where I'm blending part of the quote into my sentence, so it is not a full sentence quote. You would not capitalize the quotation, the beginning of the quotation, because it is part of the grammatical structure of my sentence. So again, what I have in green here is my wording, and then I blend into the quote, which is in white here. And because the quote is not a full sentence on its own, will help healthcare providers, etc., etc., is not a full sentence, I would lowercase the W. And we need to capitalize acronyms. So acronyms are abbreviations of words and phrases where you typically take the major words of a phrase and take the first letter of each. So for example, Centers for Disease Control and Prevention are known as the CDC. Note that it's not an exact first letter of each word here, but because it's an abbreviation of that, CDC is capitalized. Federal Bureau of Investigation becomes FBI, all caps. And note that the phrase does not have to be capitalized when it's written out in full in order to require that the acronym be capitalized. So here you have return on investment, which is lowercase. If you write it out in an essay or a report, it's always going to be lowercase, unless you start to abbreviate it with an acronym, in which case you capitalize ROI. Same with end of day becomes EOD. As soon as possible becomes ASAP. And I spelled that wrong. Okay. Good thing to point out there, ASAP. Information technology becomes IT. A SWOT analysis written out is lowercase. Strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats analysis would be SWOT, SWOT, capitalized, and then analysis. All right, so thank you for listening and have a wonderful day.